Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I hope you're all in good shape for another useful day's work. We turn now to item 12 on your agenda, page 36 in the handbook, and I'm delighted to welcome Sir Geoffrey Howe, who will be replying to this important debate on economic policy. It's motion number 469. It'll be moved by Councillor Ian Cootes on behalf of the Norwich South Conservative Association. After Mr. Cootes, I shall call Mr. Egger of Enfield North, and after him, I shall call Councillor Marguerite Wood. Mr. Cootes.
Mr. Chairman, the most significant economic fact of life in this country today is that our standard of living has declined and continues steadily to decline. In 1976, for every pound increase in earnings, prices increased by £2. But surely you say things are improving. Yes, in the last 12 months, for every pound increase in earnings, prices have increased by £1.80. In the past 3 months, for every £1 increase in earnings, prices have increased by £1.60. The man in the street and his wife, and particularly his wife, knows this very well. The rate of descent may be slightly slower, but they're being dropped by the present government down and down into the chasm of declining living standards. They would be even angrier than they are today if they realised that, contrary to popular belief, the other advanced Western countries have over the past 12 months, almost without exception, improved their people's standard of living, and they haven't got North Sea oil. And to what do we owe this appalling state of affairs? To a socialist government who chose to let the pound fall in value rather than contain its own expenditure in 1975 and 1976, who chose to let British people think that they were earning their wages in those years, whereas in fact they were partly financed by borrowing from abroad, who boosted inflation with their budget deficits rather than reduce government expenditure, who heaped act after act on the back of British industry, thus pushing up its costs and thence its prices, who did insufficient to push up tax allowances at the same rate of inflation, and so ensured that the government's share of income increased and the man in the streets declined, who, when faced with inefficient firms, instead of letting them go bankrupt so that new firms could spring up using the same factories and manpower but organised on an efficient basis, chose to pour your money and mine into propping up the existing situation. The Saga of British Leyland is a microcosm of all that's economically wrong in this country, and we've now reached the point where we are consuming, for current purposes, the seed corn of investment monies rather than closing down plants and introducing realistic manning levels. All these examples of the easy option approach of the Labour Party under both Wilson and Callaghan explain why our standards of living have fallen and are falling. But what of the brighter signals that have been coming through in recent months? The drop in the rate of inflation, the lower interest rates, the balance of payments surplus. Let's look at the rate of inflation. In the 3.5 years since February 1974, the value of the pound has almost halved. We now have the Tory pound of February 1974 shrunk into the socialist 55 pence pound of today. This amounts to a social revolution which is welcome to many in the Labour Party, but which is anathema to the majority of people in this country. It means that everyone who has ever saved, be it in a building society or the post office, through a life policy or a pension scheme, has been robbed of their money through the cynical inactivity of this government. And even if the government forecast of a 12 to 13% inflation rate by the end of this year is achieved, it means that the value of money will still halve in every 6 years. It means that prices will be going up at a faster rate than ever known in this country until the socialists came to office in 1974. So much for a better rate of inflation. What are the drop in interest rates? We can all welcome these and the beneficial effects they should have on investment. But they came about only after the capitalist countries of the free world had lent us money and the International Monetary Fund had insisted on there being a ceiling to government borrowing. It's the IMF we have to thank, and even Mr. Healy realises this when he waves his certificate of good behaviour from them before the Socialist Party conference. The improvement in the balance of payments is very simply due to the increasing flow of North Sea oil. And even now, the government are resisting some restoration in the value of the pound that would help curb our inflation rate because they fear it would make our exports uncompetitive. Our fundamental problems are those of investment, of productivity, and of incentive. And all three must be tackled in the breathing space that North Sea oil gives us. Investment is inhibited in a jealous society, which fails to understand profit is essential to trigger present and to finance future investment. The return on capital employed has fallen in real terms to a third of what it was 10 years ago. Investment is inhibited if there is a mass of government regulations covering everything from pricing to whether a new door can be put in a building. Investment is inhibited if the self-employed come to regard themselves as selected for discriminatory taxation and discouragement by neglect. And investment is inhibited if productivity is low. And productivity is the key to our future as a manufacturing and trading nation. But each unit of investment in this country produces half that of a similar investment by our European competitors. Last year, productivity in this country actually fell by 7%. Talking to the unions or having greater management skills will not alone solve this problem. The British Steel Corporation, which has 98% union membership and the most advanced employee participation schemes in this country, has had to stop production at its new Redcar coke ovens because of a manning dispute over which talks have been going on for over 2 years. This appalling productivity situation is causing a decline in the standard of living of every man, woman and child in this country. And it's in the interests of consumers, and we're all consumers, that trade unions should no longer be given financial immunity from the consequences of their actions where those actions prevent the attainment of manning levels achieved in other European and North American countries. Nothing short of this is going to keep us competitive, and nothing short of keeping competitive is going to rule out mass emigration from these islands when the North Sea oil runs out. It's in the interest of everyone, including all trade unionists. And finally, to the creation of incentives. We must recast our system of direct taxation. At present, it's the most penal in the Western world, whether one looks at a man having the state take 40% of every pound he earns above £16.50 per week, or £25 if he's married, or an executive paying 83% on his top earnings. Our capital taxes are complex, overlapping, and taken together create an enormous burden. They must be overhauled. And it will not be enough to finance this by increasing indirect taxation. The totality of government spending must be reduced. We no longer wish to finance over 50% of our activities through the state. After 40 years of reasonable prosperity, we should not expect the state immediately to shoulder responsibility for our individual misfortunes. If it meant a reduction in taxation, it would be better if we all looked after ourselves in the first week or two of sickness or unemployment. It would encourage saving, it would add to human dignity. Before the people of this country, Mr. Chairman, lies not an assured and prosperous future, but an opportunity to create one. The individual freedoms, the incentives, the personal responsibilities in which the Conservative Party believes open the door for this opportunity to be seized. I beg to move.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Mr. Tim Egger speaks for the motion, and after Councillor Wood, who will speak after him, I shall call Mr. Fane Vernon. Mr. Egger.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in political terms, by far the most important factor influencing the economic strategy of any future government will be the revenue from North Sea oil. Because as a direct result of oil production, the balance of payments is already improving the pound looks stronger and short-term foreign money is flowing into Britain. Oil means that for the next 10 years at least, Britain is likely to have a healthy balance of payments. And this in turn means, inevitably, that any future government's economic policy is less likely to be dictated by external economic factors. And then one goes on from there, and one may well ask, what happens, what will happen if the socialists win the next election? Because socialists have always liked spending public money to increase the power of the state. And yet, time and time again, the restriction on that has been that they have found that the electorate objects to picking up the tab to pay for their extravagances. And the advent of oil will make it possible for the state to go on a spending spree without the electors having to pay for that spree. Ladies and gentlemen, no wonder the Tribune Group was so quiet last week. You can imagine them in their fringe meetings, licking their lips as they see the oil, the product of the private enterprise system at its best, that will pay for nationalization of all the banks, of the insurance companies, and for the nationalization of a major company in every industry. For the Tribune Group at least, the North Sea account would offer a blank check for subsidies to whomever they please. In short, ladies and gentlemen, if the socialists win the next election, the revenue from our oil will not be used for economic growth. It will be used to destroy capitalism and the private enterprise system in our country. By the mid-1980s, there will be no industry, no firm, no individual that is not beholden to the Labour Party for either import controls, subsidies, or jobs. The only memorial when our oil runs out to that oil will be a few showpiece industrial plants nicely situated in marginal constituencies. It is up to us here in this hall to show that it is only the Conservative Party which is able to grasp the opportunity given by the advent of oil. It is only the Conservative Party that will be able to convert the oil revenues into economic growth which will secure the future of our country. And ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, a Conservative government must take the opportunity to grant stability for the economy. There must be no more chopping and changing of economic policies, for the most important thing for industry is to have stability and to be able to plan ahead. Second, Mr. Chairman, the funds saved by the cuts in public expenditure, which we will have to make and which I hope we will make speedily, those funds, coupled with the oil revenues, will mean that corporate and personal taxation will be not just cut, will be slashed. Because it is only by doing that that Conservatives will be able to prove that economic growth comes not from government diktat, but from the motivation of millions of people who together make up the economy. Ladies and gentlemen, over the next 10 years, oil will give us a unique opportunity as a country. If Labour is in control, they will fritter it away and subsidize and nationalize us into poverty. From that, we will never recover. Conservatives will use the oil revenues to restore incentives and to recreate the conditions for industrial investment and economic growth. I beg to support the motion.
After Councillor Marguerite Wood, who speaks against the motion, and following Mr. Fane Vernon, I shall call Mrs. Jenny Turco. Mrs. Wood.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I oppose the motion because I think for the party to continually talk about inflation is quite wrong. we should address ourselves more particularly to the word productivity, and that is how I will address you this morning along those lines. I think that productivity should be increased by recognising the needs for profits, rewarding by incentives, encouraging investment, including those of employees, and illustrating the truth, and it is a truth, that competition and low unit costs are the only way to keep prices and taxes at an acceptable level. We must also reduce the bureaucratic government interference. We must also correct the gross imbalance against the employer's power to manage, and there is an imbalance and an interference that we must redress. Now, we don't recognise skill in this country, and there should be better pay for those who are skilled and the people who have ability. We should also, as I've said, the first essential would be to encourage investment. The usual method is to ease controls on prices and on profits and dividends. Taxes on capital, especially the capital gains tax, should be altered and interest rates reduced. Reflation, which is bandied about so blandly, is supposed to reduce unemployment, but the causes of employment, as we know at this conference, are many. And they range. The reasons for unemployment are those, they include, for instance, the fact that high wages are paid for some unskilled workers. Also, we have the restrictions of the Protection of Employment Act. The suggestions and comments I'm making are not particularly acceptable to the Labour Party or are intent on pandering to sections of their members, and they do not consider the country as a whole, and that is diabolical. Catching votes by causing chaos by frequent changes in the middle range of taxation is offering the country a spoonful of honey when what it needs is a massive dose of capital investment to bring about economic recovery. I address myself now to another aspect that I don't think would normally be touched on in such a debate. I've said we should cease to talk about inflation and talk about production instead. And to that end, the country expects the education system to produce leaders, managers, engineers, the vital people, the design and make people. It expects the education system to produce craftsmen, technicians, skilled operatives. But, ladies and gentlemen, where are these people? Their numbers are certainly not increasing in our institutes of higher and further education, our universities and polytechnics. Cairn Cross, in The Guardian, led an inquiry entitled "Why the British Won't Make It." His opening sentence was, "More students at British universities are reading philosophy than productive engineering." But, ladies and gentlemen, we will make it, because our party must and will get the education system right this time, because that is geared to productivity. We must be mindful of the imbalance between the productive and non-productive sectors of the workforce. Therefore, we must redress in our schools. You may think this has nothing to do with the debate, but I beg you, I implore you to go back to your constituencies. If you're on boards of governors, look at the curriculum, see what the balance is between the academic, the non-academic, the subjects that will lead towards producing a good, productive workforce in this country. Monitor, if you're on boards of governors, the slant of the subjects. By whom, you may shout to me, who monitors the curriculum? The Taylor Report, this great debate that's been an enormous fiasco, tells us exactly nothing. It's all talk, ladies and gentlemen. We're paying lip service to it and doing precisely nothing. So what we need this morning to help productivity, instead of talking about inflation, I stress that again, we need to have conservative input and control of the local education authorities. We need conservative input and control of governing bodies. We need to spell out the nation's predicament at the coal face, that is the classroom, to enable some of the blinkered teachers to appreciate their role and their accountability. And if this is topped by a conservative control of this country, we shall win through.
Thank you, Mrs. Wood. Mr. Vernon, who speaks next, comes from Whalley East, speaks for the motion. And after Mrs. Jenny Turco, I shall call, as I said, Mr. Wickenden, and after him, Mr. Richard Bull. Mr. Vernon.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the vital need for the next Conservative government is to identify itself wholeheartedly with the entire British workforce from top to bottom. The workforce, not the unions. Because the Labour Party is no longer the party of Labour. It has become the party of bureaucrats. Bureaucrats and hypocrites. It is dominated by a trade union movement, a backward and defensive trade union movement, whose leaders are politically motivated and a million miles out of touch with the interests of their members. It is the party of restrictive practices, overmanning, and consequently low real wages. So, since the Labour Party is no longer the party of Labour, let us make it absolutely clear that we Tories are the party of Labour, because we believe in hard and successful work at all levels. We recognise it and want to see it better rewarded. So let us shape our economic policy accordingly. And it's not a matter for fine-tuning. Fundamental change is necessary because we've got to change attitudes. So what we want is a massive switch from direct to indirect taxation. We want the first £5,000 of all incomes earned and investment to be free of tax and the costs switched to VAT, so that all workers have a real incentive to earn more, keep more, and spend it as they choose, and the investors have an incentive to back the workforce with their savings. Now, of course, we would need to make adjustments to old age pensions, small incomes, etc. But this would not be inflationary, because although the cost of living would rise with higher VAT, the money would be there in the pockets of the people to meet it, and indeed it would encourage more output. In fact, it solves one anomaly at a stroke, if I may borrow a phrase, because tax rebates to strikers would be a thing of the past, because if you ain't paying taxes, there ain't no rebates. The conventional wisdom is that elections are not won, they are just lost by the outgoing government. Well, that's not good enough for us. What we want is a sweeping victory by a united Conservative Party that is offering real change, that believes in and backs the British workforce and will again give it confidence in itself. Everyone who works in independent industry, the wealth-creating sector, is a potential Tory voter, not just a third or half already vote, all of them, because they all have healthy Tory prejudices, like wanting to earn more money, like wanting to keep it more to spend themselves, and like cutting back bureaucracy, the cost of which they can't afford. There is nothing wrong with a British workforce that good leadership and a fair system of rewards will not put right. I support the motion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. Mrs. Jenny Turco, speaking next, speaks against the motion. As I say, she'll be followed by Mr. Wickenden, Mr. Richard Bull, and then by Mr. William Hague. Mrs. Turco.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, this motion purports to be talking about economic strategy, when it is in fact considering only 3 tactics to overcome this country's problem of inflation. These may be fine in themselves, but together they do not add up to the right approach to the economy. They represent a small section of the problems which face us, and they highlight a dangerous negative trend. What is wrong is the whole economic structure, and we are all concerned with the present gross interference in the economy. If it is suggested that a future Conservative government should continue and extend interference with market forces, are we not moving further towards the collectively organised state, which is an anathema to us all? We opposed increased government expenditure, but only insofar as it is wasted on complicated and irrelevant bureaucratic machines. We support increased expenditure, particularly on efficient equipment on defence. We support increased expenditure on the maintenance and improvement of law and order. We support increased defence in the field of providing education which is relevant to our children's needs, not the administrators. Of course, I dislike intensely the burdensome taxation which is levied upon me as a self-employed small business person. But of the 59% of our GNP which was claimed to have been spent by government, there is a 7% error which they have admitted since. Additionally, a further 7% is a part of the National Insurance Fund, which goes in at one end of the system and comes out at the other end as benefits. Therefore, total real expenditure is at 45%, a level identical to the booming and much vaunted West German economy. What is needed is an economic strategy which recognises and encourages the development of our productivity. Inflation is a godsend to any spendthrift Labour government because it hides the level at which taxation begins to bite. We need a policy of incentive to the individual, an incentive which is offered by a definitive strategy set out on page 7 of the Right Approach to the Economy. Yes, it includes the main points of this motion, but goes much further to highlight 9 major areas where a future Tory government needs to be active. Better methods of collective bargaining are included, stricter controls of the money supply, the removal of unnecessary restrictions on business expansion, improving management skills in their handling of workers' problems. Above all, the economic strategy is designed to raise entrepreneurs' confidence so that they will expand. A much more positive approach than the narrow-based motion, which, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to oppose. Thank you.
Mr. Wickenden, who speaks next, speaks for the motion, and he'll be followed, as I said, by Mr. Richard Bull. Mr. Wickenden.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, at last year's Brighton conference, I spent most of my time inviting you and distinguished members of the platform to help me prevent Felixstowe Dock being nationalised. And from the ordinary dockers at Felixstowe, I bring heartfelt thanks for the help which was given from this conference and from the platform, not least from that much maligned institution, the House of Lords, who showed themselves so much more in tune with ordinary people than the socialist government was. Ladies and gentlemen, at an ungodly hour this morning, I wallowed in my bath and listened to a very chirpy Shadow Chancellor speaking one very great truth, which is being ignored at this moment by everybody, not least the City of London. There is a euphoria in the air about our economic situation. The balance of payments is in credit because of North Sea oil. The real balance of payments, our manufacturing and service balance of payments, is in the most appalling deficit and continues to be in the most appalling deficit. And whilst North Sea oil gives us a wonderful breathing space, for heaven's sake, let us be quite sure that we use that breathing space to reinvest and to re-equip industry and not to spend on day-to-day living. Some time ago, in fact in the middle of the Felixstowe battle, I was asked by the Financial Times to sum up my attitude to running a business, a sort of idiot's guide to how to put the problems of British business right in one paragraph, the sort of thing that the media are very fond of. And like a fool, I fell for it. But looking back, I didn't in fact get it that wrong, because what I said then I think can be applied to governments as well. I said, keep it simple. Remember that running ICI is like running a fish and chip shop with a few more noughts on the end, and running a government's the same. Don't believe your own publicity, and that comes hard from a director of a company with such a highly geared PR department as we have, but nevertheless it is true, and we should also adhere to it. And thirdly, avoid consultants and experts like the plague, and that too. Ladies and gentlemen, simplicity is the keynote. Simplicity in taxation is the keynote. Let us away with direct taxation, if possible completely, and I do not believe those who say it cannot be done over a period of time. Introduce a tax credit system to protect the less well-off in our society. Swing on to indirect taxation. Let people pay a proportion of the extra money which they will have in their pockets for the essentials of life, like the education of our own children and our own health, with protection for those who cannot afford to, and let us make business simple again. Yesterday we heard over and over again, rightly, the problems of the small businessman in dealing with excessive government. Let us not believe that those problems do not also exist in large businesses. They do. We are better off because we can afford to employ people to help solve those problems. But the cost is enormous, and the cost goes to the consumer. Let us cut out all these tremendous drains on our business, get government simple, get taxation simple, and let us all get back to standing on our own feet.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Wickenden. I'm sure we wish you all well as prospective parliamentary candidate for Dorking. And I'm sure too that our president, who has this moment walked in, would have been delighted to have heard your remarks about the House of Lords. I'm sorry he wasn't here. Mr. Richard Bull speaks against the motion, comes from Greater London. He'll be followed, as I said, by Mr. William Hague, and after him by Mr. Nicholas Ridley. Mr. Bull.
Mr. Chairman, this motion incorporates the major themes of the right approach to the economy: cutting taxation, cutting government restrictions, cutting interest rates. It's an entirely worthwhile policy, and it'll be a very good way of getting the economy on the road again. It is indeed, it summarises many of the points put forward in the National Young Conservatives document, A Workers' Charter, which I commend to you. It is indeed on sale outside in the YC store. But there's one area in which this motion and the right approach to the economy concerns me, and that is its concentration on public expenditure. If we're only concerned with restricting it, as this motion suggests, that's entirely right, because in the next few years, as the revenues flow in from the North Sea, it will be very tempting for any government to earn itself cheap popularity by a major programme of public expenditure, new hospitals, new schools, all very worthwhile in themselves. But it's not the way to get the economy moving again. James Callaghan suggests he is going to follow that road of easy temptation. It is essential that the Conservatives concentrate on getting investment back into industry and getting the economy moving again. So restrictions are quite appropriate. But what many Tories talk about, what we've heard this morning, and what the right approach to the economy talks about, is cutting public expenditure, although we still haven't been told really how these cuts are going to be made. And this is something that could do this party a great deal of harm. When the Labour government has cut public expenditure, and public expenditure cuts means closing schools, closing hospitals, imposing hardship on the people of this country, they've done so very reluctantly, saying that they wouldn't do it if they could avoid it. Many Conservatives seem to delight in public expenditure cuts. They seem anxious to present this party as full of heartless ogres, not caring about the suffering that public expenditure cuts will produce. That is something I think we need to think about. We need to consider our presentation of this policy. There is even a case, as Jenny Turco has said, for considering whether or not, in the longer term, the policy of cutting public expenditure is justified. The right approach talks about the increase in public expenditure in the last few years, but it's risen largely because we're in a recession, because there are 1 million more people out of work, and that costs a lot of money. We can scarcely cut public expenditure by taking them off the dole. The way to cut expenditure in that way is to get them back to work again, and that's what the right approach to the economy is concentrating on. It's also not easy to see the justification for cutting public expenditure in the longer term by international comparison. As Jenny Turco has said, these figures were presented to the Select Committee on Public Expenditure when it looked into British public expenditure as against the international comparison. And they discovered that this massive figure of 59% of the national income taken by public expenditure was entirely wrong, a product of presentational errors by the Treasury. So it does mean, I think, that we need to re-examine very carefully whether it is necessary to cut public expenditure, certainly whether it's necessary to slash it. I think it would be much more necessary instead to keep public expenditure from rising, as it has an inexorable tendency to do, to make sure the valuable resources are diverted into investment and new production, but not to engage in a massive programme of cutting and slashing, of closing more hospitals and more schools. If we suggest that that is our policy, we shall be only too justified in expecting the electorate to reject us. Mr. Chairman, I beg to oppose this motion.
William Hague, who speaks next, speaks for the motion, comes from Rother Valley, and will be followed by Mr. Nicholas Ridley. William Hague.
Mr. Chairman, as a 16-year-old, I represent what may well seem to be the lost generation for the Conservative Party. By all accounts, some 10% of first-time voters voted Conservative in the last general election. If that trend continues, then perhaps some mathematician in the hall would care to work out just how many years it will be before it becomes impossible for the Conservative Party to win a general election. That lack of support stems largely, in my belief, from the fact that the party is seen, rightly or wrongly, as standing for the maintenance of the existing political and economic order. The young people who voted so overwhelmingly against our party last time are people who believe in change, not change for its own sake, but change because they are dissatisfied with the existing state of affairs in Great Britain. But the only form of change that has been offered to them in the past has been change to the left, an irreversible shift of power, as the Labour Party would call it, supposedly to the people, but in reality to the centralised state. They must now be shown that it is possible to change in the other direction. Indeed, not only possible to change, but necessary to change. Every subsequent Labour government has encroached upon the liberty of the individual citizen. Every subsequent Conservative government has failed to do more than only marginally restore it. But what sort of world do young people want? Like the rest of the British people, they share the aspirations and hopes of the Conservative Party, but in this case, it is not translated into Conservative votes. They want a society where effort and initiative are rewarded instead of stamped upon, where those who work the hardest receive the greatest reward, where those who take the greatest risk receive the largest profit. They want to live in a world where it pays to work, and more important, where it pays to work in Britain. They don't accept the socialist argument that the government knows what is good for the people better than the people do. They don't want to go to Callaghan's promised land, which must surely rank as the most abhorrent and miserable land that has ever been promised to the people of a nation state. But most of all, they want to be free. Free from the government. The government, they think, should get out of the way. Don't intervene. Don't interfere in their lives. And I trust that Mrs. Thatcher's government will indeed get out of the way. There is at least one school, I think it's in London, where the pupils are allowed to win just one race each, for fear that to win more would make the other pupils seem inferior. That is a classic illustration of the socialist state, which draws nearer with every Labour government and which Conservatives have never reversed. It's all right for some of you. Half of you won't be here in 30 or 40 years' time. But I will be, and I want to be free. Economic policy can guarantee that freedom. Denationalisation of certain industries and forcing others to cover their costs. Large and progressive cuts in public spending. The year-by-year reduction of the proportion of GNP spent by the state. In short, by the creation of a free market economy. There comes a time, as a country moves nearer and nearer towards the socialist state, when the party of the left ceases to be the dominant party of reform, and it is the party of the right that becomes the party of radicalism and change. If we should fail now to reverse the process of socialism, then we can write off the future of this party and the future of this country. But if we rise to the challenge, if we determine to roll back the frontiers of the state, then we will not only capture the imagination and support of the young people, we will not only save free enterprise, but we will save Great Britain, and we will create the capital-owning, property-owning, home-owning democracy in which we believe.
It's quite clear from that reception that the one slightly depressing statistic which I suppose must turn up somewhere in any economic debate didn't really take away from the force and vigor and encouragement of that remarkable speech. Thank you very much. After Mr. Nicholas Ridley, Member of Parliament for Cirencester and Tewkesbury, I shall call Mr. Alan Ponting, and after him Mr. Richard Alexander. Mr. Ridley.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen,
I've just received a report which I would like to share with you. It is a report from the headmaster of St. Scanlan's Comprehensive Toll Puddle on a boy called Jim. It said we made Jim head boy last term. The last head boy left under a cloud. He was caught with Marcia the matron washing his dirty linen in public. He made all his friends, some of them rather undesirable, into prefects. The new head boy wants to abolish all the prefects. He's going too far the other way. It then goes on to list some of the subjects which Jim has been studying. Obedience. This boy does exactly what he is told. Signed, TUC. Economics. After a slow start, this boy is beginning to learn now. Signed, IMF. Drama. We made Jim Moses in the last school play. The trouble is he mortgaged the promised land to a boy from the Middle East. Greek. The only words he has learnt, which he repeats loudly and stridently, are Bacchus or Sacchus. I'm afraid we're going to have to do the latter. Scripture. This boy will not learn that envy is one of the 7 deadly sins. And it is that I want to say one short word to you about. The reason, as so many speakers in this debate have emphasized, why our gross national product is going down, production is 1.5% lower than when the government came in, why real take-home wages are 5.6% lower than when the government came in. The reason is fundamentally because socialism is the politics of envy, the striving fruitlessly after equality. There is an international market in wealth creators, in managers, in skilled workers, in hard workers, in all of those who provide the wealth for this country. And if you make this country the least attractive country in the free world for them to live in, then you will get declining living standards, the emigration of the best, and finally you will end up in the socialist hell of equality and poverty. We must take envy out of our tax system. We must take envy out of our lives, because if we allow it to continue as part of the central theme of socialist dogma to rule all of our tax policy, we will end up, as I say, as one of the poorest nations in the world. And the message that I want you to give from this conference today is that if we want to recover our prosperity, we must cast envy out of the taxation system.
Thank you, Mr. Ridley. Mr. Alan Ponting, who speaks against the motion, comes from Windsor and Maidenhead. After him, I'll call Mr. Richard Alexander, who I'm afraid will have to be the last speaker. Mr. Ponting.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, this motion says we should balance our books. We should put our financial affairs in order. This is the wrong priority. Oil will balance our books. This country looks beyond oil. We must lead the search. Balancing is important. With oil, however, balancing is easy. It does not require undue intelligence to balance the books of this country with oil. Even Dennis Healy can do it, even though his hand is held by the IMF. With oil, we can live well. We may even live very well for 20 years. Holland, where I have lived and worked, shows the path we can take. Holland has massive reserves of gas. Holland has closed her mines. Holland exports her gas. Holland runs her cars, not on petrol, but many cars on gas. Holland has a massive social security scheme. Holland is a docile, contented country. We can follow this path. We can forget our glorious past, as Holland did, and live contentedly off oil for 20 peaceful years. But what of the future? The world needs energy beyond oil. Britain is uniquely placed to lead this search. We are the only major Western country self-sufficient in energy. And we have some damn good brains in this country. We can lead the development of new sources of energy. This country can rise with the party that leads with a purpose. And the Conservative Party is the party that lives not just for today, but for the tomorrow and the tomorrow of our children. Mr. Chairman, I beg to oppose.
Thank you. Mr. Alexander speaks for the motion, comes from Newark, and as I say, must be, I'm afraid, the last speaker. Mr. Alexander.
Mr. Chairman, we know at this conference where our economy has gone wrong, because it is a directed economy. And a directed economy has been directed on the grounds of ideology rather than of reality. It is the ideology which has produced excessive state expenditure on nationalization, the activities of the so-called National Enterprise Board. And who on the National Enterprise Board really believes in enterprise? And their interference in the day-to-day operations of industry, which has brought the economy to its present level. Our next government must concentrate on the expansion of opportunity, of enterprise, and of economic freedom. If we have this spirit, many of the debates and things we're asking for at this conference will be of less importance. We will no longer have the same problems on the expansion of industry, of small businesses, and of unemployment. It's excessive government interference and excessive government expenditure of national wealth which has not yet been created, which has brought about the inflation from which we are now suffering. It used to be said that the country was sick because men and women in industry did not work hard enough. I happen to believe that this is not generally true. It used to be said that our economy was wrong because we hadn't enough investment in it. I happen to believe that this is not generally the case. We have the men willing to work. We have the investment. But men and women find no reason to work harder because they know that they will have so much taken from them in taxation. A man who finds that in his wage packet he is working for the government 2 days out of 5 has not the slightest incentive to work harder for himself or for the country. And there is the secret of where our economy and our answer to inflation must first lie. A man who has a small business which he wishes to expand, whether he be a small industrialist or a farmer, has not the slightest incentive to expand for himself, his workmen, or the economy. when he knows the dreary toll of penal taxation which will fall upon him and his family sooner or later. And this is basically what the next Conservative government should be about as regards its future economic policy. Like many enormous problems, the answer is simple, but bailing out the incompetent, the work-shy, and the inefficient in our strike-ridden industrial sector should have no place in a future Tory economic policy. Bail out the individual worker who wants to work, and the firm which wishes to expand, and the country will reap a harvest which it deserves and which it will have earned.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander. Before I invite Sir Geoffrey Howe to reply, could I just make one very small point? The stewards tell me that they are very concerned at certain moments where there are very considerable movement of people along the passage at the back of the hall. Try when you want to leave, please, to do so quickly and quietly, and if we all don't use it at the same time, it'll be much easier for everybody. It's a great pleasure to invite Sir Geoffrey to reply to this important and I think wide-ranging debate. We admire him for the immense workload he carries, the message he gives us, and we look forward to hearing from him now. Sir Geoffrey.
Mr. Chairman, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, Conference, I know, will wish to thank all those who've taken part for a most stimulating and encouraging debate on which to start the day, to thank Ian Coots for the lucid and splendid way in which he opened the proceedings, and if he will forgive me, above all, to thank the young man with the entire future ahead of him, William Hague, how one wishes the learning process in the Labour Party had been as speedy as it has been in the mind of William Hague. If they'd learned half as much as he has done, we'd be a great deal better off. They haven't even learnt, Mr. Chairman, that when we get some good news about our economy, that causes us no dismay. Why should we be dismayed if even this foolish government has finally been compelled to accept just a little of our advice? If they've begun to show that in their hearts they know we're right? Because almost every improvement that has taken place has resulted from a step away from the policy on which they've been elected, from the result of taking our advice. So why should we be sorry if some of the sinners begin to repent? Because nothing that is good for this country of ours can ever be bad for the Conservative Party. But that's not the real question. The question is whether we've got anything to be grateful to this government for. Mr. Healy claims that the pound sterling is now stable, but it's due to his mismanagement that the pound has lost more of its value more quickly than ever before. He claims that living standards will fall no further, but it's due to his mismanagement that the average family is £8 a week worse off in real terms than they were 3 years ago. He claims that production is picking up, but it's after 3.5 years of Healy that we're producing no more goods than we were 7 years ago. He claims that unemployment will go no higher, but it's under his mismanagement that Britain's dole queue has grown 3 times as long as it was when we left office. And he claims, finally, to have conquered inflation. But then, that's a subject on which Mr. Healy, how can I put it, has always conducted himself as though truth was a scarce commodity, to be used very sparingly, if at all. And even his own Chief Secretary, Joel Barnett, was last week obliged to challenge Mr. Healy's latest claim. How Mr. Healy must squirm with embarrassment in the presence of a colleague with a greater respect for the truth than himself. The fact is that the man who now claims to be solving the crisis is the very man who created the economic chaos of a year ago. And we can have about as much confidence in his fitness for the task as we should have if Nero had been appointed in charge of the fire brigade. Certainly the harsh logic of parliamentary arithmetic has for a time stopped this government doing yet more damaging things. And you may have noticed that the Liberal Party tried to claim some credit for that. What nonsense. Haven't they noticed that the household gods of today's Labour Party are to be found in Hague Cemetery, not in the National Liberal Club? Does anybody doubt that if the Socialists were ever to secure a majority, the Liberal Party would be cast aside with about as much ceremony as a pair of old boots? This socialist government has been tamed, for the time being, not by the Liberal Party, but by the British people voting Conservative in by-election after by-election. And the British economy has been made less dangerous than it was a year ago, not by the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, but by the International Monetary Fund, the very international financiers at whom Mr. Healey now wants, as he puts it with such characteristic good manners, to thumb his nose. But Dr. Johannes Witteveen, the managing director of the IMF, would have had more than that to complain about if he'd visited Brighton last week. He should certainly have asked for the conference slogan, "We're winning with Labour," to be rewritten. "We're winning with Witteveen" is the slogan that should have been above the Labour Party platform. Because he's the man we have to thank. Even Mr. Healey told us that he brought back a certificate from Washington to prove it. And you may have wondered just exactly what kind of certificate that could have been. I think, Mr. Chairman, it must have been a provisional driving license. And whatever it was, we intend to see that Mr. Healey's ticket is never renewed. Because the pound sterling has been made more secure only because the balance of payments is moving into credit. And that owes nothing to socialism and almost everything to North Sea oil. And it was Providence that placed the oil beneath the sea and private enterprise that brought it out. And of course, it's the prospect of revenue from the North Sea that makes the coming election, as Tim Eggar pointed out so clearly, of such crucial importance. The situation today is not unlike that which we faced at the end of the war. 6 years of socialist misery, followed by more than a decade of conservative prosperity. And just as our people then were only able to exploit the opportunities when we cast off the straitjacket of socialism and set the people free, so we face the same fundamental choice today in our response to North Sea oil. And perhaps the most important thing about that choice is the way in which we present it to the people. There's nothing automatic about the benefits of North Sea oil, nothing at all. They'll only be won by hard work, properly rewarded. So the people won't hear anything from us about the golden decade that's meant to lie immediately ahead. The people won't believe, nor should they believe, that kind of talk from any party leader. Indeed, it's probably our most important task in the months and years ahead to rebuild the bridge of confidence that has been broken between politics and the British people, to promise less and perform better, to avoid presenting every new policy as though we discovered the secret of eternal life. What we can do, if we choose, is to encourage the new resources to flow into private investment, at home and abroad, to flow through the hands of the people, people like Keith Wickenden, my new parliamentary neighbour who's done so much to promote prosperity and defend free enterprise, into the hands of people like that to create new and expanding businesses and new employment. Or on the other hand, if the socialists have their way, we can see the new resources swallowed up by the National Enterprise Board, by nationalisation, by more bureaucracy, by the full programme of socialism to which the Labour Party is entirely committed. Do not let us allow the people to forget that fact. Whatever may be the Operation Concealment that took place at Brighton last week, the Reds no longer lurk beneath the bed. They're on the bed, in the bed, all over the bed. Indeed, Mr. Chairman, give them half a chance and they will nationalise the bed. That's why it must be our most important purpose to ensure that North Sea oil revenue passes into the hands of the people, into the hands of young people like William Hague, of his generation and those that will come thereafter, and not into the hands of Mr. Wedgwood Benn. This determination to keep the public sector under control is central to our objectives, to the conquest of inflation, to the restoration of incentives, to the creation and above all to the spreading of property and wealth throughout the people. For those are the conditions that have got to be achieved if we're to secure the return of prosperity, the improvement of our social services, indeed the defence of freedom itself. That's why I welcome this resolution and the policy set out in it, which point exactly the way forward. Margaret Wood said that instead of talking about inflation, we should talk about productivity. Well, we should talk about productivity, all right, but I think that we would rather accept her advice and the advice of Jenny Turker by talking about productivity and about inflation, because I'm sure that Ian Coots was right to begin with inflation. Inflation destroys savings, destroys confidence, destroys living standards, destroys jobs, and the present rate of inflation, or anything remotely like it, will destroy the free society. So the conquest of inflation must come first. It's to conquer inflation that even this government has been obliged to follow a strict monetary policy, and we welcome that. That's why old-fashioned talk of reflation, as though we could blow the thing up like a football, is so misleading. An increased budget deficit, whether from tax cuts or from higher public spending, is only possible if the government can finance that deficit. And if government debt begins to rise too high, then as Ian Coots pointed out, interest rates will rise as well, and the so-called reflation will become inflation. Either way, it will destroy the very prosperity it was meant to create. And that's why it's so important for public spending to be reduced. Of course, this doesn't mean we don't want better social services. Richard Bull and Jenny Turker were anxious to make that point clear. For heaven's sake, we want modern hospitals, good education, decent pensions, a well-paid police force, as well as as much as any of our opponents. But we know, as they do not, that you can't get these things simply by bigger and bigger spending. We know, as they do not, that money can't be spent, better services cannot be afforded, unless the money has first been made, unless we first created the wealth. We know that we've lived too long on the assumption that the responsibility for paying off the overdraft of today can safely or honourably be placed upon our children and our children's children of tomorrow. We know too that the wealth is created not by politicians, for heaven's sake, or by civil servants, but by the people. People for whom investment earns a proper return, for whom enterprise and energy earn a just reward, for whom, above all, it is worthwhile to work. This isn't just theory, Mr. Chairman. We've seen this philosophy work in the past for the benefit of every family in our society. Labour governments have been in power for 14 out of the 31 years since the war, and Conservatives for the other 17. During those 31 years, the real take-home pay of the average industrial worker has gone up by about 2/3. And of every £6 of real extra take-home pay achieved under government since the war, no less than £5 was notched up during the years of Conservative rule. That's the way it was, and with patience and with courage, that's the way it can be again. That's why this motion, and all the speakers in the debate, have been so right to call for a dramatic reduction in the weight of taxes on all those who could be creating the new businesses, the new jobs, the new wealth in the community. And of course, even Mr. Healy now claims to have got this message. The man who now claims credit for knocking a penny off income tax is the man who started off by putting 5p on. The man who set out to provoke howls of anguish from the rich is the man who ended up plundering the pockets of the poor. I must say, I find him no more convincing and no more attractive than the former mayor of a South American city who fought an election on the platform, "I steal, but I give some back." For us, our tax reforms are at the very heart of our programme. They're set out in the right approach to the economy. They've been worked out in detail by my colleagues in the Finance Committee. We were delighted to have a demonstration this morning from the rostrum from Nick Ridley of the wit and wisdom one of those colleagues, which he's always displaying in the House of Commons. Delighted also to have the Finance Committee whip, the most strenuous and with great difficulty the most silent whip in parliamentary history, who has done such noble work in mobilizing the Finance Committee team, and also David Howell here on my right, who has provided the leadership for the formulation of our tax proposals, and whom we much admire for his persistent and persuasive advocacy of the Tory cause. I hope we appreciate them all. We shall lift the tax load that inflation has imposed on higher income earners because we know that the skilled workers and managers are the yeast of our economy. We shall cut the higher rates of income tax to levels which prevail in the rest of the civilized world. We shall cut and cut substantially the basic rate of income tax. We shall raise and raise substantially the threshold at which people start to pay tax, because it is quite intolerable, yes, intolerable, Mr. Chairman, that those who go to work should be less well rewarded than those who stay at home and draw the dole. It's equally foolish to savage the rewards of savings and investment. After proper consideration, we shall revise the entire structure of capital taxes. But we need emergency action more urgently than that. So we propose an enterprise package of early reforms. We shall ensure that capital gains are only taxed when they are real. We shall draw the teeth of capital transfer tax, for we have no use for a tax which discourages investment, destroys jobs, and prevents a thriving business being handed on from father to son. And perhaps above all, we shall cut the investment income surcharge, for it is in truth a tax on savings. Where is the justice in singling out for special vindictiveness the income which pensioners draw from the fruits of a lifetime of thrift? But I must ask this conference to be under no illusions. It won't be easy to do what we mean to do. It will take time to repair the damage that the taxes of envy, as Nick Ridley so rightly described them, have done to our economy. This is the purpose of economy and public spending. And this too is why we're ready, as Fane Vernon and Keith Wickenden explained so very clearly, and as we set out in The Right Approach to the Economy, to accept the case for higher taxes on spending. Because the people of this country now heartily endorse the principle we have been proclaiming, that pay as you spend is far more sensible and acceptable than pay as you earn. Mr. Chairman, 26 years ago, Winston Churchill led this party to victory and our country to unprecedented prosperity with the battle cry, "Set the people free." Those words were more than just a party political slogan, because they go to the heart and the centre of our continuing Tory faith. All our economic policies are based, now as then, on that same objective: set the people free. Free from the shackles of socialism which have crippled the market economy. Free so that rewarded success can discriminate in favour of effort and against sloth, in favour of the saver and against the spendthrift, in favour of the ambitious and against the complacent. Free so that no break and no limit can be set upon the creative spirit of our people. Free, too, so that the wealth that freedom can create can be used to bring new freedom to those who have none. You know, as I know, that these principles are right for the people of Britain, for all the people of our country. You know, as I know, that economic freedom and political freedom are indivisible. Let it now be our purpose to carry these convictions into every corner of our land and once again to set the people free. Last week, Mr. Callaghan offered a choice: back us or sack us. This week, I offer you the best of both worlds: sack them and back us.
I put motion 469 to the vote. Those in favour, please show. Thank you. Any against? Carried with one dissentient, two dissentients. Thank you very much. We end, therefore, by sending Sir Geoffrey away, don't we, with our warmest good wishes and our gratitude to him and his colleagues for the very important burden that they carry. Thank you very much, Sir Geoffrey, for replying to our debate. The next debate chair will be taken by Mr. David Davenport Handley. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, could we please start the next debate? Could I have the cooperation of those leaving the hall, please? Would they please leave quietly? Thank you very much. We now come to motion 596, Food and Farming, which stands in the name of Mr. Neal. I am calling an addendum in the name of Mr. Macquarie from East Aberdeenshire. It arrived too late to be printed in the supplementary agenda, and so I will read it to conference. The addendum reads, add at the end, and further expresses serious concern about the total uncertainty facing the fishing industry. In particular, the diminution of stocks, and calls upon a Conservative government to give support to the industry's aim of an exclusive 50-mile management zone. Mr. Neal has indicated that he accepts that addendum. I will now call Mr. Neal, and after him I will call Mr. Macquarie, but before I do that, I should like to welcome to the platform the Right Honourable John Payton, the Shadow Minister of Agriculture, who will reply to the debate. Mr. Neal.
Mr. Chairman, North Cornwall may be better known for tourism, but it's also one of the most agricultural seats in the country, and it even produces some of the milk that's going into the coffee of the representatives now queuing to leave the conference hall. Don't take the farmers for granted. I can vouch for the quality of that milk, but I don't know whether I can vouch for the willingness of them to go on producing it. As well as being agricultural and being its prospective candidate, it's also labelled a critical marginal seat. You may have come across the MP, John Pardo. He's the Liberal spokesman on anything of no consequence. Young David's very own inflatable Goliath. Yet if we are to win seats back like North Cornwall and North Devon and Truro, we shall only do so by winning back the farmers. And they are not automatically Conservative. But far more important than that, we want British farmers to actually produce more food, both for home consumption and for export. Not just to benefit the farmers, but the consumer as well, because we can produce it more cheaply in real terms than our competitors. Understandably, though, the farmers will not risk further investment unless and until we adopt a far more realistic approach to agriculture in Britain. The lack of confidence and the aimlessness in British food production is now undermining our ability to withstand competition from inside and outside the EEC. Socialism in agriculture is a flop, and Mr. Silkin is Mr. Flop 1977. He's achieved, Mr. Chairman, the unbelievable, an actual drop in livestock production for the first time in years. And then the socialist government only further confounds matters. Its handling of the economy and its deception of the consumer have wrecked the confidence of farmers. Inflation and the manipulation of the pound have been catastrophic. Food prices in the shops have risen by almost 100% since 1974. In no way do the returns to the farmers match that. And in the same period, their farming machinery alone has gone up by as much as 2.5 to 3 times in some cases. But it is the effect of the government's so-called economic policy on the value of sterling which is the most damnable. First, the socialists promoted its virtual collapse as against other currencies, and now they are hell-bent in preventing its actual rise. And how could they let it fall with impunity? Because they knew that the separate currency exchange rates on food, this infamous green pound, would protect the consumer. And who subsidises that situation? Largely the farmer. At one stage, he was expected to trade at a 46% disadvantage as against his EEC competitors. And even now, he's over 30% down. I wonder how Leyland would take to that. Could they compete with the Germans, as the farmers are expected to? They can't even sort themselves out of the normal rate of exchange. Mr. Chairman, our latest party statement on economic policy may augur well on promoting the revaluation of the pound sterling back towards the present value of the green pound. But no one supposes that that will be enough. On top of it, there must, under a Conservative government, be a steady and irreversible devaluation of the green pound in order to place our farmers on an equal footing in terms of competition with their EEC counterparts. Otherwise, this motion is meaningless. Further, despite German resistance, we must negotiate a method of regulating the agricultural exchange rate to prevent similar disparities reoccurring. This would remove the major grouse about the much maligned agricultural policy. And I, for one, shall listen with interest to the reply by the spokesman on agriculture, for on his words could hang the success of prospective candidates, Conservative candidates in rural constituencies. Our motion then refers to cheap food. The myth of regular supplies of cheap food must be blown by us. Consumers can so easily be led into the cuckoo land of socialist nonsense, of the kind portrayed at their conference debate on food and the EEC. No farmer will believe the Conservative Party's honesty of purpose on agricultural policy until they see and hear us confront the consumer with today's reality. There simply is no cheap food regularly available. And for some to contemplate deserting the EC to tramp the world for cheap food is utter folly. If we are to maintain any semblance of price stability, it can only be done at the risk of surpluses. It is the risk of shortages that rattles the price to the consumer. So this motion calls for a Conservative policy on food production whereby the consumer pays the economic cost. Only the most stupid farmer would press any government to create such a change overnight. The immediate effect on the housekeeping of every household would be too profound. There must nevertheless be a gradual and committed course away from the excessive political interference in the subsidising and confusing of the consumer. The consumer as a taxpayer is even paying for his own confusion.